Well, thank you. As you know, August 1st, the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement went into effect. It's another, big compliment to Canada for its global leadership and soft power leadership, particularly with regard to Ukraine, and a country which is obviously of strategic importance for Canada, given the large diaspora community in Canada. So, I mean, there's a number of areas. I mean, more than anything, the free trade agreement represents opportunity, as Ukraine has, in the last few years since Euromaidan, has moved away from the Russian market and the Eastern market. They have had to shift those goods first to Europe under the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union as part of Ukraine signing the association agreement. But also the Canada free trade agreement is a great victory and a great opportunity for Ukraine, as well as for Canada, to break down those trade barriers and expand trade. So it's a new market for Ukraine. It's a relatively new market for many Canadians too. In terms of areas of export, from the Ukrainian side, obviously there's huge agriculture production. There's chocolate. There's a lot of foodstuffs. There's also there's steel. There's many other products that can be sent to Canada from the Canadian side towards Ukraine. There are a lot of products in Ukraine. I've been living in Ukraine 18 years, and in '99, the products at the store were somewhat limited, or they were just European. Now you can get a lot of products in Ukraine that you could get in North America. The difference is you may have to pay more. However, with the free trade agreement, that's going to bring down the cost of Canadian goods and so forth. I was shocked just a few months ago to find little maple syrup candies at one of the grocery stores from Canada. One of the grocery stores in Kyiv had been brought in from Canada. So little things are starting to spring up on the market. But in terms of opportunities for Canada, Ukraine is rebuilding. It's rebuilding after the war. It's rebuilding after a long legacy of Soviet dominance and Russian aggression. There's going to have to be some studies done. There's going to have to be some research, and people, smart business people are always going to find niches and opportunities. Ukraine now, for example, has a ban on wood imports. Hopefully that'll be lifted. That might open some opportunities for Canada. Canada has great natural resources that Ukraine can use for some of its heavy industries, particularly out east, and so it's going to take some exploration and some searching. But there are definitely niches out there for Canadian entrepreneurs to find in the Ukrainian market. Well, currently there's the European Union Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. Now there's the CUFTA, the Canadian-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and then with other GUAM nations. So GUAM is a loose semi-military grouping of Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, and Moldova, which has never really taken off like it was hoped to, but it was a kind of a preliminary step to NATO, and it basically aligned the 4 of the 15 former Soviet republics into kind of a loose military grouping. But within that, there's also a free trade agreement. Now, there's not a lot of trade that goes on in that grouping, although they are trying to expand it. I know President Poroshenko was just in Georgia, had a pretty productive visit there in terms of business relations. So they're trying to get that trade up. Azerbaijan's energy resources to Ukraine have never been fully tapped. There is quite a bit of trade with Moldova, but it's smaller turnover. So there's potential there, but beyond that, those are the main ones. Well, yes, I mean, particularly the Deputy Minister, Nataliya Mykolska, has been very aggressively, looking for these opportunities to find new markets for Ukrainian goods and conversely, allow the import of more foreign goods into Ukraine. In the end, the consumers get a better deal, better quality products at lower prices. Now, with regard to Japan sent a trade mission over to Ukraine this spring. It was some of the biggest Japanese companies, Fortune 500 companies that had come over to look for opportunities. Japan's economy has been stalled for a number of years. They're looking for investment opportunities and good, reliable projects. I know South Korea is also looking at a number of areas, including, transportation and agriculture and so forth in the high-tech industry, as well as Japan. So the Asian countries are already here. China of course, is involved in looking for opportunities, particularly in agriculture. Well, in short, Ukraine's becoming a potentially new opportunity for many countries to look at. They didn't look at it before because typically Ukraine was sending its best stuff to Russia. That's not the case now. Trade with Russia is grinding to a halt, and former products that went formerly to Russia are now going to the European Union. Some will go to Canada, some will go to Asia, and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunities in Ukraine now that entrepreneurs around the world are finding out, because not every day that you have a market of 42 million new consumers. So, and particularly with Ukraine's geographical location on the eastern part of Europe, close proximity to Asia, makes it quite a unique opportunity. Yeah, I mean, actually, the South Korean ambassador is a friend of a friend, and we've been trying to meet him for a while. South Korea is one of the nations that is taking a lead in looking at these investment opportunities. Obviously, there's competitions among all nations, and certainly among the Asian economic powers, Japan, China, and then South Korea. South Korea is looking out for its interests too. So they're particularly looking at agriculture and transportation, high-tech opportunities with regards to not only Kyiv but also Kharkiv, Lviv, Odesa. So they're scoping out a strategy, and these are when a country gets behind investment like this. They're usually obviously there's a government mandate. We need to do more trade with Ukraine. That's one part, but then the second thing is, the big businesses that really, employ tens of thousands of people in those countries and indirectly control much of the money. They start looking at investment opportunities, and if they don't look at $10,000, $100,000 opportunities, they look at 10 million, 100 million opportunities. So these are factors of a huge scale, which bode well for Ukraine's economic growth in the coming years. I mean, economic growth is going to be about 2% this year. It would have been 3% if not for the blockade. But, the economy is definitely picking up, and it has been, I would say, consistently since about the fourth quarter of 2015. I certainly see it in my business as kind of a leading indicator of where the economy is going. But, the economy is definitely moving in the right direction. And this interest, these trade missions will ultimately result in investment dollars being brought to Ukraine and, Ukrainian jobs and a better quality of life for the Ukrainian people. Even though Ukraine is getting good marks for free trade agreements, we'll see what the results will be, but in general, we're cautiously optimistic. Ukraine is getting very poor results in terms of privatization. And, roughly there are, I think, around 3,800 state-owned enterprises. Only 10% of them actually make any money. So 90% of those state-owned enterprises lose money for the state. And so when Aivaras Abromavičius, the Lithuanian-born Minister of Economy, was in charge of the ministry, he was saying, look, let's just get them off the books, 1 hryvnia, take them off the books. That way the state doesn't cost the state any more money. Because inevitably these are tools of oligarchs. They're parasites on the state budget. I'm not saying Ukraine should have all 100% private property. There should be no strategic interest. No country does that. But there are far too many dinosaurs on the state books that eat state budget money. So Ukraine, I believe, would do much better to privatize a lot of these industries. Now, particularly with regard to the Oblenergos and energy sector, this is one of the, unfortunately, the failing grades that Ukraine has had in recent years. Now, under the IMF agreement, which is Ukraine's lifeline, which turned things around in 2015 economically, the $42 billion IMF agreement, one of the targets for 2016 was that Ukraine would have $300 million in privatization revenues. And then in 2017, this year, they would have $600 million. So $300 million and then $600 million. Well, how did they do last year? They did about $1 million. They came nowhere close to the $300 million target. Now, the way they were supposed to do that, there were 5 Oblenergos where they were going to give a majority stake, not a minority stake, but a majority stake. Mykolaiv, Khmelnytskyi, Ternopil, Kharkiv, a few others. None of those sales took place. They kept on getting delayed and delayed. And now the most recent news I had this week from talking to officials of the State Property Fund is, they'll privatize those next year. That's the plan. So Ukraine is not moving forward very effectively on Oblenergo privatization. The other part of the privatization that they were supposed to do in 2016 was the much talked about, never successfully privatized Odesa stateside port. Now the problem with that is this is a classic example of how the oligarchs manipulate the system. So they basically put a poison pill into the Odesa stateside port. So the courts have ruled that the Odesa port owes Mr. Firtash $300 million. So let's say you're the lucky Canadian investor who wins the bid, and you put up $150 million, which is at least the minimum value. Probably the port is estimated closer to probably $300 million. But let's say you get it for a steal, you get it for half price, $150 million. Well, the next day, the lawyers from Mr. Firtash are going to say, hey, congratulations, now let's settle that $300 million debt. So whatever price you pay, you're paying $300 million on top of that, just to get Firtash out of there. And then you got to hope and pray that the books are clean beyond that, and that there's going to be no other claims from any other oligarchs or nothing that the auditors missed. I mean, that seems to be the case, but with some of these privatizations, you never know. That's a lingering risk for Ukraine. So that's a problem. So the Odesa port side tender failed on 2 occasions, and there were no bidders, primarily due to this Firtash debt obligation. So Ukraine, again, is failing to meet its privatization goals under the IMF agreement. So kind of as a switcheroo, and with an idea that, okay, we're not going to sell these majority stakes, these Oblenergos, but we're going to go back to Oblenergos, which have already been privatized, and we're going to sell minority stakes that the state owns. So usually, a lot of these Oblenergos were privatized years ago. They're controlled by 3 or 4 different oligarchs. Now the state's going to sell its minority portion, in those state properties. Now, former state properties. 25% shares are fine in North America. You can have a minority stake and be an influential shareholder. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, being a minority shareholder is not worth too much. The majority controls the rules, and being a minority shareholder unfortunately doesn't provide you with many protections as you would have in North America. This looks like it's targeted from the state trying to get the oligarchs to pony up and buy the other minority stakes. That might be successful in the case of Mr. Akhmetov and ДТЕК. Some of the properties are owned by them already with a majority share. So it looks like the state's trying to get the oligarchs to basically pony up and buy some of these out. Now, there's the old Oblenergo players are typically the biggest oligarchs: Akhmetov, Kolomoisky, the Circus brothers, Mr. Grigorishin. Interestingly enough, in 2016, he received a Ukrainian passport. Now, he's obviously had investments in Ukraine for many years, but why that was interesting was under Ukraine's Russia cannot control energy assets. By giving Mr. Grigorishin a Ukrainian passport, it allows him to compete in the Oblenergo privatization field. So it's a disappointing move, I think, by the state. I hope it works out for them. I hope they do raise some money through this privatization. But for foreign investors, North American investors, I don't see any of them seriously considering. And I've talked with a number of them this week. In fact, I don't see any of them seriously considering participating in the privatization of minority shares in Oblenergos. When Ukraine gets serious and wants to do the majority shares, then there will definitely be a lot of foreign interest. I know there's been interest from India, China, even Canada, and European countries. So when Ukraine gets serious about privatization, you will know, because that'll mean that they're offering majority stakes. Well, that's the irony. I mean, the Ukraine, foreign direct investment is still low. It's still below where it needs to be. There's still a lot of Russian money here, and eventually you've got to bring clean North American capital into Ukraine to break that dependence on the Russian economy. So even though the trade is down, a lot of these assets are directly or indirectly owned by Russians, and so you're never going to quite have a lot of economic independence until that money is replaced with Ukrainian capital or European, North American capital. I'm a supporter of Ukraine. I'm a supporter of this government, and I want to see it succeed. But at the same time, we need to call a spade, and privatization is a failing of this government so far. Now they can turn that around, but so far it's been a failure. Let me give you a quick rundown of what the autumn looks like with regard to health care, pension, and land reform, and it ties back into privatization because they did a switcheroo. So I can go on a 3 count. So just to give you a rundown of what we're looking at legislatively this fall. In the July session, Parliament decided to postpone a vote on healthcare reform. Now, it's passed in the first reading. The reform is quite comprehensive. It fixes the broken Soviet system and it brings Ukraine up to international standards. And I won't go into all the details, but in short, it borrows some from the Canadian system, some from the Polish system, and the British system. So it takes some of the better parts of different foreign systems and creates a Ukrainian system which works for people. Now, that was passed in the first reading against quite a bit of opposition from the medical mafia, from pro-Russian legislators, and even some members of the majority coalition. But it was delayed on very technical reasons. One member of Parliament, Ms. Bogomolets, passed out in the ladies' rooms and wasn't able to sign the minutes to try to delay it, and then she was rushed to Theophania. Very typical Soviet stuff. These are delay tactics. The vote will come in September, maybe the first week, maybe the third week. It's not quite clear at this point, but it looks that there are at least as many, if not more, votes in favor of the reform this time around. So eventually it's going to pass. There were some amendments made. There were a few things that were changed. For example, the copay was taken out, which I think is a mistake. Ukraine, there's an issue of the Constitution saying everyone's guaranteed free medical assistance. Okay, but how do you define medical assistance? Does that mean you don't have to pay anything? And when you don't pay anything, then you have a system that reeks of corruption, and where doctors demand bribes for treatment and medicine's free, but everybody has to pay, and that's part of the broken system that has to be fixed. But the new system will provide insurance for everybody. The copay issue will be revisited down the road. So we anticipate healthcare reform getting passed in September on the second reading. Another important vote that will come up in September is the pension reform. It passed also on the very last day of the July session with around 250 votes. Some opponents rejoined the coalition to support it, along with Poroshenko Bloc and the Narodny Front. So we anticipate a second vote on pension reform, and that will get passed, which is also very critical for Ukraine because that is an IMF-mandated requirement that Ukraine's got to fix its pension system. So slowly but surely, the IMF is pushing Ukraine in the right direction, both in healthcare reform and pension reform. One other thing that was talked about by the IMF and initially required was a vote on land reform. As you know, Ukraine, again, another legacy of Soviet times, is the state can own the land, and you can have no foreign ownership. That's still something that if you look at sociology, is not particularly popular. It's not popular in North America too. I remember in the 80s, everyone was worried about Japanese investment, and then when the 90s recession came, everyone wished we had more Japanese investment. So these things are very cyclical, and it's easy to whip up people, especially populist politicians, who talk about, we got to keep our assets for ourselves. These foreigners are coming in and buying it, which is all kind of a myth. But anyway, with regard to land reform, Ukraine has been able to successfully negotiate a delay, a postponement of land reform. And the reason is because it's so politically unpopular at the moment. The government has so many other things on its plate with pension reform and the war and the economy and so forth. So land reform has been delayed. It's still one of the IMF requirements. They're not going to require it now. It looks like it realistically would probably come after the 2019 presidential election. But in return, that's why Ukraine offered the privatizations, because the IMF saying, okay, if you're not going to do land reform, what are you going to do this year? And they said, well, we're giving you pension reform, we're giving you healthcare reform, let's go back to privatization. I mean, again, Ukraine's not offering their prized assets in these privatizations, but hopefully it'll generate some income, and Ukraine can at least partially meet its target for privatization. So it looks like the privatization minority stakes are a bit of a switcheroo on behalf of the Ukrainian government rather than do land reform. So it looks like land reform may be 2020, maybe 2021. With regard to land reform and land ownership in particular, that brings up a very important issue. One of the ways Ukraine has its own, it ties its own hands is by not fixing the land code. So if you're a farmer in Cherkasy or, Kirovograd and you have 100 hectares, well, if that was North America, well, you'd go to the bank and say, hey, I need to borrow against it for harvest time and this and that. But here that's not possible. You can't use land as collateral. And that, you talk about working against self-interest. So the law needs to be modernized. This is not 1970s Bolshevik, occupied Ukraine. This is 2017. and, allowing people to use their assets. Ukrainian citizens, if you want, we'll tackle the foreign issue later, but at least allow Ukrainians to use their land as collateral for loans, for harvest time, for agricultural equipment, and so forth. So that's just a very practical example, but one of the reasons why land reform must be done in the nearest future. And think about that. I mean, if you really want to grow the economy, the way you grow the economy is banks makes loans. When banks make loans, the economy grows. It's just an economic reality. If Ukraine really wants to unleash its economic power, that would be a great place to start.